All right, we're going to be in Revelation 12, and we're not going to go a long time tonight. I know a lot of folks are tired. They've had a long day. It's been a long day, so we will study some. I'm glad in the prayer that Tim mentioned our men's breakfast. I know for a lot of folks, if you're not at the breakfast, it's occurring while you're trying to get ready, and you probably don't have time to go on and catch Mickey's devotional live as it happens. But if you have time to go back and watch something during the week, it would be well worth your time to go back and take advantage of what he talks about. It's always time well spent if you do that. So. All right, let's jump in. If Revelation were divided into acts, as in a play, Act 1, Act 2, something came up. Okay. Act 1, Act 2, Revelation 12 would be the beginning of Act 2. And so the story of Act 2 is going to unfold over Revelation 12 through 22. Now, what's going to occur in Act 2, if you look at Revelation 11, verse 18, near the end of the verse, the nations were enraged, and your wrath came, and the time came for the dead to be judged, and the time to reward your bondservants, the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, the small and the great, and to destroy those who destroy the earth. In other words, what's going to happen in this Act 2, the divine powers will culminate in the divine destruction of the forces of evil, the final defeat. And so Kester gave this outline of the second part of Revelation. Chapter 12, Satan is thrown from heaven to earth. Chapter 13, the beast and the false prophet conquer. Revelation 17, the harlot rides on the beast. Revelation 17, the harlot is destroyed by the beast. Beast and the false prophet are conquered. In chapter 19, Satan is thrown from earth into the abyss in Revelation 20. And so one thing he points out in writing about this second part, in this story of the triumph of God over evil, the ordinary limitations of time and space do not apply. As the warring parties traverse a battlefield that stretches from the heights of heaven to the abyss of the earth beneath. And if you think in terms of your favorite, science, or not science fiction, but superhero series, that's kind of how those things tend to go. Revelation 12 through 15 consists of one distinct cycle of visions within the longer drama. The section depicts a messianic war that extends from Christ's incarnation, chapter 12, verse 5, to his second coming, chapter 14, verses 14 through 20. And so readers of John's time and readers of our own time, we're living in between those two events. And so if you're trying to think about where are we as we read this, that maybe will help you to think about that. This section, Roper points out, these Christians trying to figure out, we've got this trouble with Rome, and Rome is part of the problem, but what they're really being told in this section is that the devil himself is who is ultimately responsible for their troubles, and it also explains why Satan despises Christians. So that's something else to think about as we go through this. And so it's not so much Rome that hated them, but the devil himself, and Rome was simply the tool of Satan. And so we remember God's team wins. Pick a team, and don't be foolish in the choice you make. That's one of the things we come back to over and over. Now, as we get into this, the first couple of verses of chapter 12, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child and cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. And there's a dragon that is standing over her as she's about to give birth, ready to snatch this child. It's a bit of a long reading, longer than I would prefer to share, but I want you to give you some background so that you'll understand when the original audience was hearing this read, some bells were going off for them. It would almost be like if I said, okay, there's this movie and somebody leaves a small town and goes off to the big city and does really, really well, but then comes back to the small town and falls in love with his high school sweetheart, you'd be like, oh, that's a Hallmark movie. It's every Hallmark movie. That's kind of what you know that theme because it happens over and over and over. Well, there was a story in ancient literature that told this story, but Roman emperors and people like that used the story to tell a different ending. So let me give you the background of this. I'll try to make it as quick as I can. Stories of the battles between the forces of good and evil help to win the audience's loyalty to the side of good and to alienate them from evil. In other words, you see a pregnant woman about to give birth and a dragon hovering over her. Whose side are you automatically going to put yourself on? Who are you pulling for? You're pulling for the woman. She's weak, she's vulnerable, she doesn't need to be attacked. In one such story that circulated in John's time, the antagonist was a fierce dragon named Python, and the protagonist was a woman named Leto, who was the mother of the god Apollo. When Leto became pregnant by the god Zeus, the dragon pursued her in order to kill her and her child. The north wind rescued Leto by carrying her away so that she eventually found refuge on the island of Delos, which lay on the Aegean Sea. There the woman gave birth to Apollo and to Artemis. 4 days later, Apollo set off in pursuit of the dragon, soon slaying the creature to avenge his mother. Roman emperors were able to put the tale to good use by associating themselves with Apollo, whose defeat of the evil dragon was said to have ushered in an age of peace and prosperity. Citizens of the empire could be expected to see analogies between the woman in the story and the goddess Roma, who was the queen of heaven. Her son would be the Roman emperor who overcame the forces of evil and chaos so that the light and peace could flood the world. Caesar Augustus was hailed as a new Apollo, for his reign was said to mark the beginning of a new golden age. The Emperor Nero liked to present himself in the guise of Apollo, his image on coins bearing the radiant beams from his head that were Apollos' trademark. So here's his conclusion here. When John tells about a pregnant woman and a dragon in Revelation 12, Christians in the 7 churches would have heard echoes of the familiar story of Leto, but they would also find that John's version reverses the usual implications of the tale, so that in this version, the woman in labor is not a Greek goddess, but the people of God. The child is not the emperor, but Christ, and the dragon represents the forces that oppose Christ and threatens his church. In the end, a story that was used to celebrate the popular culture is now transformed in a way that helps readers resist being assimilated into that culture. And so it's a little bit of background, but it's also there to help us. This isn't just some crazy story. When they hear it, it has some meaning to them. It registers with them. Of course, it is an inspired story by God, but God is going to use this to tell the story of Jesus and him conquering. So a little bit of background there. Hopefully that helps. So let's read through the first 6 verses, and we'll talk a little bit about them. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Remember, I mentioned we'd see that in Revelation 12. I mentioned that this morning. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days, the 3.5 years, that partial period of time that we've talked about for in several instances already. So you read the story, who are you going to side with? You're going to side with the pregnant woman, the one who's about to give birth. And so what John is doing here, the readers identify with the woman and with the child, whose identity is going to be Christ. That's going to be very clearly revealed. And so people hearing this, John's original audience, they'd recognize that John's vision points to Christ's deliverance from death and to his exaltation to heavenly reign through his resurrection. Now, crucifixion isn't mentioned in this. It's a high-level summation. But John has pointed out, his readers know the Messiah died. We see that in chapter 1, verse 5, chapter 1, verse 7, chapter 1, verse 18. We see it 3 times in chapter 5. So they know about that. And so this vision, and this is a statement, well, I didn't mark who it was from. It's probably from Kester. This vision is not designed to repeat what readers already know, but to stress that Christ's death was not a triumph for evil, appearances notwithstanding. Remember, we talked about in the previous chapter these martyrs in the streets and victories being celebrated. Christ's death was not a triumph for evil, appearances notwithstanding. The dragon threatened Christ, but in the end it is Christ and not the dragon that end up on the throne. So the sign appeared in heaven, and this is not the abode of God, heaven. The context here would suggest this is to where the stars are. It's almost as if John looks up at the sky, and the sky becomes a ginormous movie screen where he's seeing these visions. And so the first question to answer, there's a woman, so who's the woman? If you've read or studied, who would you say the woman is? The church. And this is, Revelation gets confusing because people will write, and people have said, well, maybe it's Eve, and maybe it's wisdom personified, maybe it's the Holy Spirit, maybe it's God. You can go through all of this. The woman is the church. Another way to think about it, I'm going to kind of not go through everything that we've got here on it. Think in terms of the woman being Israel. And think about it this way. There's a relationship between fleshly Israel of the Old Testament and spiritual Israel of the New Testament. Christ came through what lineage? Israel. The child comes through the line of Israel. And when you get into the New Testament, the church is referred to as spiritual Israel. Abraham in the New Testament, Romans 4:11, he's now called the father of all who believe in him. The church is referred to as the Israel of God in Galatians 6, verse 16. So one of the summations is put this way. We can therefore safely identify the woman with the generic term Israel, understanding that before the birth of Jesus, she was fleshly Israel, and after the ascension, she is spiritual Israel. And then the conclusion from Roper also is made, more important than the exact identification is the contrast between her and the dragon. Woman giving birth to this child, and then the dragon hovering over. They talk a little bit about the being clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. God is often compared to the sun. Jesus' face shines like the sun. This could be suggestive of the woman's special relationship with God and Jesus. She's wearing a crown which represents victory, of 12 stars on it representing completeness. But the woman in the vision, she's in labor. She's vulnerable. And so you see that in verse 2. And so then this great red dragon is introduced in verse 3. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. And then, of course, a lot of folks try to make out, well, what do the 7 heads mean? Some say, well, that could be craftiness and cunning. Some believe the 10 horns represent the 10 kings and the provinces of the Roman Empire. West does that. Diadems seem to reference the dragon's desire to reign. However you want to think about it, Roper's not sure if it's appropriate to draw conclusions from what is said about the beast of chapter 13 and then apply that to the dragon, because people have tried to read about the beast in 13 and then apply those characteristics to the dragon. He does say in apocalyptic literature of the ancient world, the dragon is likely the most common of all images which represent evil. So if you know apocalyptic literature of that day, you see a dragon, you've got evil on your hands. That's how you would read it if you're part of the original audience. And we see that term a couple of times, the dragon terminology, Isaiah 27, Isaiah 51. He's red, which would indicate his murderous tendencies. Remember in chapter 6 you had a red horse, and so it would also, the red indicate is possibly his sinful nature, though your sins be as scarlet, Isaiah wrote. So you've got this dragon hovering over the woman. In verse 4, tail sweeping away a third of the stars of heaven. What if you're watching this on a big screen, what would that suggest to you about the dragon? He's big. He's powerful. Now, some have tried to figure out, well, what are the stars? But more than likely, this is just in the apocalyptic story showing how powerful the devil is. You know, he flicks his tail, this dragon does, and a third of the stars just are gone. It's emphasizing his power. He's flexing his muscle in the vision, as it were. And so again, Roper, he's probably become my favorite one to read on this out of all the reading I've done, but he says, let's not get too bogged down in the details, but in the contrast, this huge, powerful dragon contrasted with this woman who's vulnerable as she's suffering through childbirth. And what does the dragon want to do, according to verse 4? When she gives birth, what does he want to do? Devour the child. So he's just like standing there ready. As soon as the child's there, he's going to grab the child and devour it. That's what he wants. Now, if you think in terms of what else we've read in Scripture, when Jesus was born, what did Herod try to do? Herod tried to take out all these young children. I don't know. It's going to be hard to make sure I get him. So if they're, we'll just get them all in that age range, and maybe we'll get him. He slaughters all the male children 2 and under. In Jeremiah 51:34, the prophet spoke of the monster Babylon, and so the average person looking at the scene would say the woman has no hope. No hope of survival. The male child who is born, verse 5, she gave birth to a son, a male child, who's to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Now this is Jesus. Psalm 2, 1 through 9 is the Old Testament reference that comes to mind when you start reading about him ruling with a rod of iron. That's a messianic psalm that goes, it's all the way back there. Everybody understood that to be messianic. In fact, that psalm is applied to Jesus in Acts 13, verse 33, Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5. In Revelation 2, 26 and 27, we'll see a similar reference when we get to chapter 19. And so Roper says the most natural interpretation of this would be to the birth of Christ. Some he does recognize hold this to be a reference to his coronation based on the language of Psalm 2 and Romans 1 verse 4. However, either way you look at it works. The rod of iron. And one of the things I'd missed related to that for some time, it became a little more clear as I went through this, but the word rule comes from a word which means to shepherd. And one aspect of the work of our shepherds is to what? They rule over us. And so that's why more often than not, you'll hear me refer to them as shepherds more often than elders, because I want us always thinking about their work and their role. They rule over us. They lead us. All those things about what a shepherd does for sheep. Those kinds of things apply to the men who lead the congregation, the shepherds. So, but the word rule comes from this word, which means to shepherd. And so Jesus, in coming, he called himself what? I'm the great shepherd. And so we can recognize him that way. And we talked about this morning, shepherds have both a rod, which is mentioned here, and a staff. The staff used to guide, to direct. The rod used to fend off enemies. But Jesus is the great shepherd. Now, it says in verse 5, he's caught up to God and to his throne. So we go from birth to ascension. We have a bunch of time in between there that's not really covered. The crucifixion's not mentioned. The Greek word here, caught up, comes from a word which really means snatched, as if you're watching the movie, woman gives birth, baby pops out, dragon lunges, but then out of nowhere, the child is just snatched away by God to heaven. Kind of how you would think of the scene. And then the woman flees to the wilderness. Then the woman, verse 6, fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. We'll see her, the idea of fleeing again in verse 14. It'll come up again. But the bottom line is the child escapes. And so naturally the frustrated dragon would turn his attention to the woman. And the woman represents who? The church. And so you've got a frustrated devil coming after the church. But the idea is, with her being able to flee, as God protected his son, so also he protects his church. And this is one of the things that's been communicated over and over and over through Revelation. Now, the 1,260 days, the 3.5 years. Well, Wes is like, well, that's the time of the Jewish-Roman War, which broke out in 66 and closed in 70. But remember what we said about the time referenced previously. It's a period of time, but not forever. Is the devil still waging war against the church today? He is. Because as we said earlier, we're living in between this period of time. And so, has the devil been defeated as of today? I see a no. Do I have any yeses? The devil's been defeated. But defeated people don't always know when the war's over, and defeated people don't always quit fighting, do they? At what point was the devil defeated? Cross of Christ, death, burial, resurrection of Jesus. He overcomes that. He pays everybody's sin. On that day, the devil's defeated, but he's not done fighting. His ultimate demise doesn't come until Jesus returns and everything ends. And then the final destruction. So he still wages war against the church. If he's not still waging war against the church today, there's a bunch of New Testament stuff that goes in the garbage that was written for us, not just the original audience. He's a roaring lion, right? Prowling around, seeking someone to devour. So he's still waging war against the church. And so we still have to be on guard. Doesn't mean he hasn't been defeated. You get to verse 7 through 12. In this section, the defeat of Satan is first seen in symbols. That's verses 7 through 9. And then is celebrated in song, verses 10 through 12. So let's look at some of this. Verse 7. Now we kind of transition the scene. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. You don't have to wonder who the dragon is in the telling of the story here, because verse 9 is very clear. It talks about who the dragon is. Verse 7 talks about this war in heaven. While there's still symbolism, whereas verses 1 through 3 seem to point to the sky kind of being this screen upon which everything's played out, verses 7 through 9 seem to point more toward the abode of God. The win of the war isn't mentioned. Nothing precludes it having taken place while Jesus was on the cross. Roper gives us that. The war could be going on even as Jesus hangs on the cross. But the point's being made because I asked the question, has the victory been won? And we concluded that it has. Verse 11 is going to state that. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even when faced with death. We win, we overcame because of the blood of the Lamb. Jesus shed his blood on the cross. And so that's how we know that that's when he won, or one of the ways we know that he won the victory. Michael and his angels waging war. We get a little bit about Michael throughout Scripture. He's referred to as an archangel, a chief or ruler sort of angel of some sort. We see Jude 9 mentioning that. 1 Thessalonians 4:16 mentions an archangel, but that angel isn't named. You get a little bit about angels through that. But he's fighting on behalf of God's people. The dragon and his angels are waging war in verse 7. So the devil has some sort of angels under his control. Matthew 25:41 supports the idea that the devil has his angels. But then verse 8, they're not strong enough. They're not strong enough. There was no longer a place found for them in heaven. That would seemingly be an encouragement to the original audience. You know, they're reading about this behind-the-scenes spiritual battle that's playing out, the devil being defeated. The devil made me do it. Great excuse. Is it ever a fact-based statement? No. The devil can't make us do anything. He can get us to do stuff, but we do that when we do things when of our own volition we choose to do them. But no longer a place for them in heaven. Now this will get into some confusion and some controversy and some discussion amongst the scholars. Roper points out that this language isn't intended to mean that the devil lost some exalted position in the eons of time before man was created. That's not what's being talked about here. Rather, he says it's a symbolic way of referring to the forces of evil being defeated and the devil's authority over mankind being diminished. And we'll get a little bit more into that maybe before we run out of time tonight. Verse 9 describes this great dragon. He's thrown down, the serpent of old, who's called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, who was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So he's described as the serpent of old. What does that call back to your mind? Serpent of old. What do you think of? Who do you think of? Garden of Eden. You think of Eve and the deception. That's where our minds go with that. The serpent in Genesis 3, either a snake used by Satan or Satan himself, transformed into the form of a snake. Devil, that word, it's a Greek word translated, which means accuser or slanderer. Satan is more of a transliterated term. They took the Greek term, made it into an English word that looks like the Greek word. It means adversary. And then this verse has a description of his work. He deceives the whole world. He's described as a deceiver in John 8:44, 2 Corinthians 4, verses 4, chapter 11 of that same chapter of 2 Corinthians in verse 14. He's described as having deceived Judas. He tried to deceive Peter. He deceived Ananias and Sapphira. He attempts to deceive all Christians. And that's one of the ways he goes about his work, is through deception. But then him being thrown down, and Kester writes a little bit about this. He says, although modern readers sometimes assume that this passage refers to Satan's fall from heaven at the dawn of time, this is not the case. Revelation 12 depicts a battle that takes place as a consequence of Christ's resurrection and enthronement. And that's true. If you read the story in the context about when is this throwing down in this battle taking place, he's right. Then he continues, note that Michael's triumph over Satan does not mean that Satan is sent from heaven to earth for the first time, for Satan was about the business of deceiving the whole world long before his battle with Michael. And so that's true. And then Kester goes on to provide this summation of how readers piece together Satan's fall and what we'd like to know about that. Roper's got some information on that too. Roper says, popular Christian fantasy has pictured a war in which God's angels, led by Michael, threw Satan and his angels out of heaven long before creation of man. And then he goes on to note that this was popularized in Milton's Paradise Lost, which draws ideas from Revelation 12. Has anybody ever read Paradise Lost? Did anybody like it? I had to read it in high school. And my main memory was like, this is like reading the old King James Bible. This is not easy to read. And that's about all I remember about reading Milton's Paradise Lost. Ellison continues. This is Roper quoting Ellison. There is no scriptural warrant for this, least of all this passage. In other words, this passage, Revelation 12, is not a theology of fallen angels. This is not a historical account of the original state of the devil and his fall from that state. It is apocalyptic imagery to present the picture of the devil's efforts to destroy Christ and his people. And now, do we wonder about the origin of Satan? Do we sometimes want to know more than maybe we do? Obviously. Roper reminds us of the secret things Deuteronomy 29:29 talks about. Some things God didn't see fit to reveal. But Roper does give us a quick summation of hints from the Bible regarding what happened with Satan and the devil. Evidently created by God, since God created all things, Ephesians 3 verse 9. Devil evidently created a spiritual being, Ephesians 6, 11 and 12. Perhaps an angel, 2 Corinthians 11 verse 14. 1 Timothy 3:16 indicates that he fell into temptation because of pride, but no details are given. John 8:44 states he was a murderer from the beginning. 1 John 3:8 adds that he has sinned from the beginning. Unknown there if beginning refers to as soon as he was created, or as soon as he sinned, or when he began to sin, or at the beginning of man's existence. We don't know exactly what that means. The Bible speaks of fallen angels, 2 Peter 2 verse 4, Jude 6. However, it does not state what the relationship, if any, of them had with the devil. And then many writers, when talking about all this, will add Isaiah 14, where Lucifer is mentioned, but the context of Isaiah 14 and 12 makes it clear that that passage is speaking of the king of Babylon. So there's some things out there, but it's one of those where we really don't know all we'd like to know about it. Great statement from Roper related to verse 9. Satan has been defeated. This loss doesn't mean that he's no longer active. It does not mean that there are no longer more battles to be fought. It does mean that the church battles a defeated enemy. And then he then quotes Morris, Christians are not working towards victory, but from a victory already achieved. And that's important for us to remember. It'd be very important for these Christians who are reading Revelation to have in mind and to have their minds wrapped around. I'm trying to decide. Well, let me go ahead and mention verse 10. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before God day and night. Part of the discussion here is that having been thrown down, he no longer is positioned to stand in front of God accusing us. And scholars debate that, though, whether he still has an audience with God where he can accuse us or whether he no longer has that ability to do that. It's one of the interesting things that people debate in that regard. But Kester's take is, Kester says, hey, Satan's expulsion from heaven means he's no longer positioned to accuse saints before God as he did in the past. And he was painted that way often in the Old Testament. And so that's kind of the debate. Verse 11, and they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. And they did not love their own life, even when faced with death. Those were the ones that had been the brethren who are being talked about in verse 10, the ones that Satan accused. They overcame. They were victorious over. Why are they victorious? Because of their own effort? No, because of the blood of the Lamb. And so it's shorthand terminology for the redemptive sacrifice of the Lamb of God. Not because Michael was a great warrior in fighting against the devil. Christians didn't overcome because of their own power and strength. Calvary may have been the devil's death blow, but it is our life flow. One of the statements that I really liked in that from Roper. And then it was because of the word of their testimony, they did not love their lives even when faced with death. Not that they loved martyrdom, it just says they didn't love their lives more than they loved standing up for their faith. Roper adapts a great statement from Philip Hughes. Since they had their priorities worked out, the very moment when the devil seemed most to overcome and prevail, when he killed them, was the moment of his defeat and their victory. And that's a pretty good spot for us to kind of leave it off tonight.